interrupted by the phone. So in my mornings ponderings, I realized, and I've probably known it forever, but just never put it together in my sort of adventure into what colonialism, what it is, and what it's done to the world. The first world is the colonial world. Probably. India's fast becoming first world. China's fast becoming first world. Russia is, sort of by the back door. Japan, I think of as first world. First worlders will probably disagree with me because the first world likes to be white. But generally, the rest of the thing is Europe, the Americas, Australasia. That's first world, and they're all colonies. They're either the colonizers from Europe or the colonies the Europeans colonized. And there's strange worlds. First and third world, I've heard. Is there a second world? Or do we skip that? Is that the developed world, a special category, or a nicer term than third? When Bernie says all the important countries have universal health care, what does he mean? He means first world. He doesn't say that. He says important, which is interesting and upsetting. And as the world turns, do these terms matter? To whom? Is the first world cheered and motivated by being first? It seems so. Is the rest beleaguered by not being first? Do people in Nicaragua sit in the bar at night and go, oh God, I can't believe I'm not an American. I wish I was French. I doubt it. I've met them. So you need to find a different explanation for how the world works. Does being first drive the individual citizens of the first world to take actions, like defending themselves against tyrants? As the divide is almost completely the colonial one, can we say that this race in which we came first was run and won in the second half of the last 1,000 years? We probably can. I don't need to use it. I don't know enough about pre-1492 travels down around Africa into the Indian Ocean and what went on and what principalities we traded with, and Marco Polo and all of that sort of stuff. But pretty much the notion of going to discovering a land and taking it over, colonizing, begins in that era. Did Alexander's Macedonians run into Persia and India and encounter cultures and civilizations they thought of as primitive compared to Macedon? I don't think that they did. Again, despite what historians glom over that particular period, what we understand from the actual history of people who were actually there or nearly within 100 years or so of his escapades was that the Persian Empire was greatly feared, and often we know from society that what is feared will be laughed at and demeaned before you go into battle with them. The leader at the time was not a great specimen. They didn't run into Cyrus the Great, mate, let me tell you, who was from the same, I believe the same bloodline as Darius. So anyway, the evidence is that they fought these people. They probably did think that they were soft because the Macedonians were famously brutally hard. But then the morality of pre-Christian Greeks is almost outside of our reach. We decide that Aristotle thought they were inferior. That's open to interpretation. He certainly said they were barbarians, but we know what barbarian means by now. It means they did not speak Greek. So he was a teacher, an intellectual who traveled as little as possible. He liked his creature comforts and probably did not read Xenophon, who was a great fan of Cyrus. But he's still a trendsetter. He's what our modern thinkers draw from, like Plato. Not a fan of either of them, as you probably know by now. And Alexander conquered Egypt, Asia Minor, Persia, and then went to India. No slouches, especially in his mind. The Greeks thought of the Egypt as the source of all wisdom, not how we think of Africa or how we thought of the Native Americans. He didn't colonize. He seemed to assimilate the Greek to Persian and to Indian, which we're led to believe his troops, by and large, did not approve of, though they married the beautiful Persian women, or so we don't know how many. In a way, in other words, it's this constant projection I find when dealing with particularly the ancients, the pre-Christians. There's a constant projection back using our contemporary values, which we then turn around and say, well, we inherited from these people. And as I look at history, I'm going, there's absolutely no connection between that and that. It's infinitely more complicated than we make it. And we make it uncomplicated because we want our rather bovine cultural system to look good. And the only way you can do that is to diminish systems that were, to my mind, far greater. Anyway, it does seem like the Romans Romanized their conquests successfully. We are told by the same people who defined the First World and interpret history accordingly, we are told the Britons decided that baths and straight roads, especially the chieftains, the oligarchs of Britain, were irresistible, and their coveting of these baths and roads were evidence, therefore, historically, of their great intelligence. They were adopting Romanism, this great superior system, and advancing themselves, therefore. This is not a vestige of the Victorians. This is the last decade in scholarship. Rome, Christianity, perhaps Islam and its Ottomans, European colonialism, creating the Americas and Australasia, the First World, are thought to be first because of the inherent goodness, the rightness, the humanism they spread over a heretofore barbaric world. Of course, they jostle amongst themselves, barbarizing each other. That seems to be First World characteristic also. This is actually the mindset of colonials about terrorism or resistance, who inevitably come hard upon the local ass-kissers. That will happen. You'll have the collaborators. The French knew that. And then you'll have the resistance. Actually, that's a rather good metaphor. They are Iceni, Highlanders, Kurds, Cheyenne, Black Panthers, etc. Third Worlders by default. That's what the First World makes of them. The seductions of the First World don't seem to entice them enough. But step back and look. I asked a Dante scholar yesterday if Dante was an early Christian rehabilitator of the pagans of antiquity for Christianity. He said no. Well, that was what I encountered dealing with Dante. I just 5 years ago now, four years ago, I did a film about Dante for PBS. So I did some study, not extensive because I don't do that, but it did seem to me as I dealt with the great poem for the first time reading it, I thought, well, what he's doing is he's doing a Latter-day Saints job on Virgil and on Cato and on the Greeks. And what a wonderful thing it is. And we know that the Renaissance, which followed hard upon Dante, the Italian Renaissance, was all about the rebirth of the classical worldviews and thoughts and stuff like that. And I don't, that seems to me totally inconsistent with Christianity even today. I don't know how they made that hybrid. And they did, and good on them. And there's much, if they did, this is stuff again that we're told. I'm not sure that they did. Anyway, it looked like that's what Dante was doing. And Dante himself seems a very much more flexible dude than any pope ever was. And indeed, he was persecuted by the Christian power structure in Florence, banished by them. Anyway, so he said no. He said among the learned people, they had to acknowledge and assimilate Aristotle and Plato. And I can see these two rather saturated minds of the highest of Christian apologists. They hated democracy on populist grounds, and here we are. So yeah, I can see those two in particular being very popular with Christianity, very censorious too. So later on that night I watched The Messenger, about that crazy teenager named Joan, the church burned at the stake. Men condemning her for inspiring other men to great acts of warfare. Churchill was a huge fan, Winston. Good for him. So I count my scholar misled. If the pagans monolithically had nasty ideas about punishment and justice meeting, the ones who converted to Christianity, the Romans, sure did. Also, subsequent Christian behaviors put them in the shade in the name of the Father, and his denial was typical in the tradition of only learned men truly understand Jesus. I beg to differ. I think there's a great streak in that. I think there's something in the hierarchy of the Father, the Son, whatever, that allows us to believe that studying Scripture elevates us, and the first Christians were not encouraged even to read the Scripture. So the Scripture had to be handed down and had to be meted out to the illiterate, until 1,500 years of Christianity. So they must have thought, and this is probably a classical idea also, they must have thought that in our community we will have the exalted ones, the bright ones, the ones who can read, the studious ones, the more enlightened, the transcendent ones who were not temptable, were not open to temptation, they were stronger, they were more disciplined, all that sort of stuff. Of course, all that's come crashing down around their ears ever since the beginning. But I think that stuck. I think that idea has stuck, and it has created that worldview has created our bastard version of what we call democracy, which is an elite. It's a republic run by the elites for the elites, and we're all fine with that. And if you're mystified by what's happening with Trump and Musk and all the rest of it, look there. Be aware that ever since my whole lifetime, exactly what they are has been exalted by us from the get-go. We just have different versions of it, But people who become wealthy are therefore chosen by somebody. And so it takes a long time for us to catch up in Christianity. And so, yes, so Christianity is a cult inconsistent with democracy. Ask anybody that and watch them rage. If there had been, democracy is an invention of the pagans. There is absolutely nothing in Christianity that is consistent with democracy. It's consistent with republics. It's consistent with rule by the elites. And that's what we're fighting for. And that's what Joe Biden's Zionism is all about. We are a superior people. If democracy is falling in the Americas, it's falling in North America. It is falling off a very low curb. Oh yeah, just an addition. One Robert Kaplan says that Western superiority is not in its people. Oh, how egalitarian! But in its systems and institutions. Which ones, for the love of Mike? The criminal justice system, the city planning system, the electoral system, the media, healthcare system. I mean, superiority is in the contact lenses of the beholder, but that claim is ridiculous, if clever. Easier to nod to than saying the British society is the great blueprint we should all ape, like the US did. Robert Kaplan needs to travel more, and he's written 23 books. That's a lot to say one thing about everything. There must be a version of how many does it take to change a light bulb for journalists? How many journalists does it take to improve public discourse? Read my book. I'm the expert. Of that another time.